We often think of medieval life as brutal, simple, and unsophisticated, a time of swords, plagues, and superstition. But what if we told you that buried beneath that grim image lies a toolkit of forgotten inventions, clever, practical, and centuries ahead of their time? From devices that saved lives to tools that shaped empires. These weren't just instruments of survival, they were the heartbeat of daily life. These 15 tools weren't just used, they were essential, and today, most of us wouldn't even recognize them. For many, the word medieval conjures images of filth, ignorance, and violence, a time defined by plagues, witch hunts, and backward thinking. The phrase Dark Ages still clings to the period like a shadow, as if human progress stalled for 1,000 years. But this idea is a product of later prejudice, shaped by Enlightenment thinkers who viewed their own age as a break from a time they considered barbaric. In reality, the Middle Ages were far more complex and far more resourceful than the myths suggest. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, people across Europe and beyond navigated a constantly shifting world. Empires collapsed and new kingdoms rose. Climate fluctuations affected harvests. Wars dragged on for decades. Disease spread without warning. And yet, in the face of instability, people adapted. Tools weren't luxuries, they were survival. Strategies, passed down through generations, refined in monasteries, villages, and forges at agricultural life, for example, demanded constant ingenuity. The heavy plough, reintroduced and refined during this era, revolutionized food production in Northern Europe's dense soils. The use of horses with padded collars and iron horseshoes increased productivity. Windmills and watermills were not rare. By the 12th century, they were widespread, transforming energy use in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution in daily life. Tools governed hygiene and medicine as much as food. Simple items like combs made from bone or wood weren't decorative. They were used to control lice and maintain some level of cleanliness. Early surgical instruments, from trepanning tools to cauterization irons, were not based on guesswork but on centuries of preserved Roman and Arabic medical knowledge, copied and stored in monastic libraries across Europe. Warfare, too, was shaped by tools designed not only for destruction but for logistics. Mobile forges, siege engines, and early gunpowder weapons all required skilled metalwork and coordinated labor. These weren't the instruments of ignorant savages. They were the calculated tools of statecraft and military planning. Religion permeated every aspect of life, and with it came tools of devotion and discipline. Rosary beads, pilgrim staffs, and relic containers were more than symbols. They were daily use objects, as common in a household as a cooking pot or a knife. Even parenting was governed by tools, from swaddling boards to feeding vessels, reflecting ideas about child-rearing that evolved alongside spiritual doctrine. Far from being static or simplistic, medieval life was a network of decisions, risks, and innovations. The people who lived it weren't trapped in darkness. They worked with what they had, and often what they had was surprisingly effective. Before it was feared as a weapon in the hands of a medieval foot soldier, the flail was a simple, practical tool, designed not for war, but for survival. In its original form, it was nothing more than two wooden shafts joined by a short chain or leather thong. One shaft acted as the handle. The other, often thicker, served as the striking head. Its purpose was not to wound, but to thresh, to separate grain from husk, one swing at a time. This process, known as threshing, was a crucial part of the agricultural cycle. After harvest, sheaves of wheat or barley were brought indoors to dry. Once dry, they were laid across a threshing floor, often a hard-packed surface of clay or stone. Using the flail, workers struck the stalks rhythmically, cracking the husks and loosening the edible grains within. It was slow, repetitive work, demanding both stamina and technique, but it was vital. Without it, there would be no bread, no porridge, no seed for next season's crop. The flail remained in widespread use across Europe for centuries, particularly before the rise of mechanical threshers in the 18th and 19th centuries. In feudal communities, its use was common during winter months, when field labor slowed and grain stores needed processing. It was a communal task, often carried out in barns by entire families or laborers working in shifts. In many rural areas, threshing with flails persisted well into the modern era. Its later association with warfare came much later and largely through misunderstanding. By the late medieval period, especially in Germanic regions, adapted versions of the flail began to appear in militia uprisings. Peasant armies, poorly equipped and desperate, sometimes repurposed farm tools into makeshift weapons. The flail was one such example. Its swinging head, difficult to block, could be devastating in close quarters, but its battlefield use was rare, impractical for trained knights, and limited by its unpredictability. Art and folklore, however, blurred the line between tool and weapon. By the 15th and 16th centuries, painters often depicted armored warriors wielding flails, reinforcing the myth of its military prominence. In truth, these were stylized or ceremonial versions, not reflections of regular combat practice. Museums today often house military flails that were likely never used in battle at all. The real story of the flail is not one of bloodshed, but of grain, of communities sustained by manual labor. Season after season, it reminds us that medieval life depended on more than swords and sieges. It depended on tools like the flail, simple, essential, and often overlooked. Long before paper currency became widespread, and centuries before modern banking, medieval economies relied on a wooden tool so simple it's almost invisible in the historical record. The tally stick, a notched length of wood, split lengthwise, served as one of the most trusted instruments of credit and record-keeping in medieval Europe. The system was straightforward, yet remarkably effective. A stick, usually made of hazel or willow, was marked with a series of notches representing a specific amount owed or paid. The size and spacing of each cut denoting various values. Once marked, the stick was split down the middle. One half, called the stock, was given to the creditor, while the other half, the foil, remained with the debtor, because the notches aligned perfectly only when matched with their original counterpart. The system was nearly impossible to forge. In England, this method was formalized by the Exchequer in the 12th century. Under the reign of King Henry I, around 1100 AD, tally sticks became an official way to record tax payments, particularly at a time when coins were in short supply and literacy rates were low. The English treasury continued using tally sticks for nearly 700 years, a practice that lasted until 1826. They weren't limited to taxes. Landlords used them to track rent. Merchants used them to document debts. Even wages could be recorded using tally sticks. In a period where physical currency was often unreliable, debased, hoarded, or simply unavailable, tally sticks acted as promissory notes. In some cases, People even traded goods and services using stocks they had received, treating them as a kind of local currency, backed by mutual trust and legal recognition. What made the tally system work wasn't technology, it was enforcement and custom. In England, the Exchequer maintained central records and physically stored the sticks in a series of locked wooden chests. Legal disputes could be settled by producing both halves of a tally and proving authenticity by alignment. The grooves and grain of the wood created a natural form of security. The system eventually fell out of favor with the rise of paper banking and coinage, but its final chapter was dramatic. In 1834, after Parliament ordered the destruction of centuries of stored tally sticks, the excess wood was burned in a furnace below the House of Lords. The fire quickly spread out of control, reducing most of the old Palace of Westminster to ash. Ironically, it was a medieval tool once used to record the state's finances that helped destroy one of its most iconic buildings. The tally stick was not a relic of ignorance. It was a practical solution to a real economic problem. And for hundreds of years, it kept the gears of commerce and governance turning quietly, efficiently, and without a single printed bill in the cold climates of medieval Scandinavia, Iceland, and parts of northern Britain. The kitchen was not just a place for food, it was a place for heat, preservation, and survival. Among the tools that made this possible was one often overlooked in modern histories: the soapstone cooking pot. Soapstonea, soft, heat-retaining rock, made primarily of talc and magnesium, was widely available across regions shaped by ancient volcanic and glacial activity. Its unique thermal properties made it invaluable. Unlike iron or ceramic, soapstone absorbed heat slowly and released it gradually. When placed over an open fire, a soapstone pot would heat evenly and hold that temperature long after the fire had gone out. This wasn't a minor convenience. In areas where wood was scarce, especially during long winters, fuel efficiency was essential. Soapstone allowed families to cook stews, broths, and porridges with minimal fire. A pot heated during the day could continue to simmer through the night, softening grains, legumes, or tough cuts of meat without burning or constant supervision. In a sense, it functioned like a modern slow cooker, centuries before electricity. Archaeological finds from Norse settlements across Greenland and northern Europe confirm its widespread use between the 9th and 13th centuries. Soapstone vessels have been excavated from the Viking Age site of Jarlshof in Shetland, and from medieval farms in Norway's Hardanger region. Some show signs of metal reinforcement, a practical adaptation to extend the life of a cracked pot. Others were carved with handles, allowing them to be suspended over fires using simple iron tripod rigs. Soapstone was also an export product. Norwegian quarries, such as those in Hillested and Erdal, produced cookware, hearthstones, and weights for trade across the North Sea, even in regions without local soapstone deposits. Its presence in households shows how valuable it was, not just for its durability, but for the energy it saved. The role of the soapstone pot was more than culinary. In homes without insulation or chimneys, it contributed ambient warmth. In smaller dwellings, where cooking and sleeping often took place in the same space, it helped retain heat overnight. Its efficiency helped communities endure seasons where food, fuel, and daylight were in short supply. Despite its importance, the soapstone pot eventually faded from common use. As cast iron became more accessible in the early modern period, and as fuel supplies improved in more developed regions, soapstone's role declined. But for centuries, it remained a quiet constant in medieval kitchens, not flashy, not ceremonial, but essential. A reminder that survival often depended on materials the land provided, and the knowledge to use them well. By the 12th century, Christian pilgrimage had become one of the most widespread and visible movements in medieval Europe. From Santiago de Compostela in Spain to Canterbury in England, from Rome to Jerusalem, thousands set out each year, not as tourists, but as pilgrims. These journeys were long, difficult, and often dangerous, and at their conclusion there was proof of completion, a small metal badge. Pilgrims' badges were cast from lead or pewter, cheap materials that could be produced in large numbers. Each one bore a distinct symbol tied to a specific shrine. The scallop shell of St. James for those who reached Compostela, the sword of St. Paul for those who arrived in Rome, or the image of St. Thomas Becket for pilgrims to Canterbury. These badges were not ornamental. They were public declarations. Worn on cloaks, hats, or satchels, they identified the wearer as someone who had made a sacred journey. The significance went beyond religious pride. In a society where few could read and even fewer carried documents, these badges functioned as informal identification. They signaled to innkeepers, townspeople, and even authorities that the bearer was under the spiritual protection of the church. In many regions, pilgrims were granted limited legal privileges and were sometimes spared local tolls or granted access to safe lodging. Badges also held value as objects of devotion. Some believed they carried the blessing of the saint whose shrine they represented. Water from holy wells or relics was sometimes poured over them before being handed out, reinforcing their perceived power. In times of illness or crisis, a pilgrim's badge might be pinned to a sick bed, worn into battle, or passed on to family members as a protective charm. The commercial aspect was just as real. Local craftsmen, often working under the oversight of cathedral chapters or guilds, produced these badges by the thousands. In some cities, entire markets were built around pilgrimage traffic. At Canterbury, the badge of St. Thomas, often showing a sword piercing a mitred head, became one of the most widely circulated in all of Europe. These mass-produced tokens offer insight into the intersection of faith, commerce, and identity. Pilgrimage was not only a spiritual act, but a social one, and the badge served as tangible evidence of that experience. It could open doors, spark conversation, and, for some, carry memories of distant lands back to rural villages. By the 16th century, with the rise of Protestant critiques against relics and pilgrimage practices, many badges were destroyed or discarded, but thousands have survived, unearthed from riverbeds, fields, and beneath cathedral floors. Today, they offer more than artistic detail. They reveal how movement, faith, and personal identity were tied together in the medieval world, not with papers or passports, but with a stamped piece of lead. Across medieval Europe, access to running water was rare outside monasteries and castles. In towns, rivers and wells were essential, but almost always at a distance from where people lived. In rural villages, water had to be hauled daily, repeatedly, and often uphill. For this, one tool made the task manageable: the shoulder yoke. The shoulder yoke was a simple device, typically a wooden beam curved to rest across a person's shoulders, with ropes or hooks hanging from either end to suspend buckets or baskets. It was designed to transfer the weight of the load away from the arms and into the body's core, balancing it across the upper back and distributing pressure evenly over the shoulders. This design allowed individuals, often women and children, to carry more weight with less strain over longer distances, and with greater stability on uneven terrain. In a medieval context, this efficiency had major consequences. Households required water not just for drinking, but for cooking, brewing, washing, and caring for livestock. A single family might need several dozen liters a day. In places without wheeled carts, and along paths too narrow or steep for animals, yokes became essential. They were used not just for water, but for firewood, harvested crops, or manure. For many, the yoke was a daily companion, worn not out of choice but necessity. The use of the yoke is documented across a range of cultures and time periods. In Europe, images of yoke-bearers appear in manuscript illuminations, woodcuts, and early paintings. In the Luttrell Psalter, dated to the 14th century, laborers are shown using similar tools while carrying goods. Written sources like manorial records and household accounts mention yoke carriers responsible for supplying water to kitchens, fields, or workshops. In monastic communities, novices and lay workers might be assigned the task as part of their daily labor. The physics of the tool reveal its effectiveness. By suspending weight on either side, the yoke creates a counterbalance. This reduces the swaying motion that occurs when carrying items by hand. It also keeps the load centered, minimizing fatigue and allowing for a more upright posture, which was crucial over long distances. Variations existed. Some yokes were flat, others notched to sit securely on the neck. While in northern climates, thicker padding or fur-lined harnesses were used during winter. Though rudimentary, the yoke addressed a constant logistical problem: how to move heavy loads without the infrastructure of modern transport. It served not only peasants, but also merchants, builders, and farmhands. In crowded urban centers, water carriers, or porteurs d'eau, became common, especially in places like Paris, where large populations depended on water hauled in from the Seine or municipal wells. The yoke eventually declined in Europe as piped water systems, handcarts, and urban planning evolved in the modern era. But for centuries, it remained part of the daily rhythm of life and scene in chronicles of kings and battles. Yet critical to the functioning of every household and village economy, it was not just a tool, it was a solution, one born of necessity, refined by use, and carried on the shoulders of millions. The caltrop was a weapon of delay, not destruction. For iron spikes arranged so that one always pointed upward, no matter how it landed, small enough to fit in a hand, but dangerous enough to cripple cavalry, maim infantry, and halt supply lines. For centuries, it served as a tactical tool in both large-scale warfare and improvised village defense. Its origins predate the medieval period. The Roman military used similar devices, known as tribuli or murex foraeus, to obstruct enemy troops and disrupt horses and chariots. By the Middle Ages, the design remained largely unchanged. Simplicity made it effective. A cluster of caltrops scattered on a dirt road or across a battlefield could immobilize advancing knights or force infantry to break formation in mounted warfare. Where momentum was key, a well-timed caltrop deployment could change the outcome of a skirmish. Horses injured by these sharp spikes would rear, collapse, or throw their riders. Shoeless livestock were especially vulnerable, and even armored horses were not immune if the caltrops struck between hoof and shoe. This made them particularly useful for defending narrow passes, drawbridges, or castle roads during sieges. What sets the medieval use of caltrops apart is how widely they were used, not just by professional armies, but by militias and peasants with limited access to weapons. In regions like the Scottish Highlands, Eastern Europe, and parts of France, records show that villagers scattered caltrops during raids or invasions, slowing enemy troops while civilians fled or organized a counter-response. During the wars of Scottish independence, for example, Edward I's cavalry faced caltrop defences laid by local forces to protect retreat paths and block rapid advance. Caltrops were easily manufactured by blacksmiths. Unlike swords or armor, they required no fine metallurgy. Scrap iron could be reheated, twisted, and shaped into spikes within hours. Some designs featured barbs or hollow cores to increase the damage and make removal more difficult. Others were deliberately rusted or coated in waste to cause infection, a rudimentary form of biological deterrence. Their use wasn't limited to battlefields. During civil unrest or border conflicts, lords ordered caltrops deployed along roads to delay enemy messengers or wagons. In cities, they could be scattered at gates or on cobbled streets to prevent mob surges or cavalry charges through marketplaces. Their presence rarely killed, but they disrupted momentum, a critical edge in the chaos of medieval fighting. By the early modern period, the caltrop began to fade in military relevance as firearms and explosives reshaped warfare, but it never fully disappeared. In fact, versions of it still exist in modern crowd control tactics and anti-vehicle strategies in the medieval world. The caltrop represented more than just a weapon. It was proof that disruption could be more powerful than force. A reminder that in the right moment, a handful of iron spikes could hold off an entire army in medieval Europe. The line between medicine and guesswork was thin, especially in the treatment of dental problems. When a tooth became infected, decayed, or fractured, there was only one widely accepted solution: removal. And for that, practitioners turned to one of the most feared instruments of the time, the tooth key. The tooth key, or clavis dentis, began to appear in surgical manuals by the early 18th century. But its roots lie in earlier dental extractions performed with pliers, forceps, and crude levers. The design resembled a door key, a metal shaft with a curved claw at one end and a handle at the other. The claw was placed against the side of a tooth, the shaft braced against the gum, and then, with a twist of the wrist, the tooth was rotated out of its socket. The tool relied on leverage rather than precision, and breakage was common of teeth, bone, or both. Before the rise of trained surgeons, tooth removal was often carried out by barber surgeons, craftsmen who cut hair, drained abscesses, set bones, and pulled teeth. Their shops hung bowls of leeches or painted poles to signal their trade, and many operated in public squares or markets. Patients sat on stools or blocks of wood, gripping leather straps or biting down on cloth. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and no reliable aftercare. Accounts from the 13th to 16th centuries mentioned tooth extraction in monastic infirmaries and court records alike. Chronic dental pain was common. Diets high in bread and low in dental hygiene wore down enamel, while abscesses and infections could spread to the jaw or even the bloodstream. In some cases, removing a tooth was the only way to prevent worse outcomes. But survival came at a price. Contemporary illustrations show swollen faces, cracked roots, and blood-soaked cloths, scenes that reflected real suffering. Despite the brutality, the tooth key became a symbol of medical progress in later centuries. Its design improved gradually, with adjustable claws and cushioned handles, eventually influencing modern dental forceps. But its reputation endured. Even in the 19th century, long after anesthesia had been introduced. Patients feared the tool for its pain and its unpredictability. The use of the tooth key reminds us that medicine in the medieval world was not without technique, but it operated in a context of limited knowledge and even more limited tools. It was painful, dangerous, and often improvised. Yet, in a time when infection could kill and chronic pain cripple, people endured it, because the alternative was worse. In the back alleys and dim courtyards of Renaissance Italy, where street crime, political violence, and factional rivalry were common, a peculiar object emerged, one that combined defense, offense, and visibility into a single handheld instrument. Known as the lantern shield, it was a hybrid tool designed for urban combat in the shadows. The lantern shield first appeared in the 16th century, primarily in northern Italian cities like Milan and Florence. It consisted of a small buckler, often made of steel, mounted with a protective housing to contain a lantern. Some versions featured a shutter mechanism, allowing the wielder to block or reveal light at will, a technique useful for blinding opponents in the dark. The shield might also include spikes, blades, or gauntlet attachments, turning what began as a defensive item into something capable of inflicting real harm. The men who carried these devices were often not soldiers, but city guards, watchmen, or civilians trained in fencing. Urban violence in Renaissance Italy was a constant threat. Disputes over honor, vendettas between families, and power struggles between guilds made personal combat a frequent occurrence. And because much of this violence occurred after dark, visibility was critical. A built-in lantern provided light, without requiring a second hand, essential for navigating alleys, identifying threats, or enforcing curfews. Some surviving lantern shields, now housed in museums like the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna or the Wallace Collection in London, show elaborate construction, spring-loaded spikes, sharpened edges, even mechanisms to trap an opponent's weapon. While many were likely custom-made or ceremonial, others were utilitarian, designed for night patrols or duels, conducted under low light. Historical fencing manuals from the late 1500s mention the shield in context with side swords and rapiers. It served as a tool of disruption. The sudden flash of light from the lantern could disorient an opponent, and the spikes or projections could turn a block into a counterattack. Its presence in both art and written sources suggests it was more than a novelty. It was a reflection of the period's merging of ingenuity and violence. Though short-lived, the lantern shield represented a specific moment in time when urban conflict required tools that were flexible, intimidating, and symbolic. It wasn't standardized military gear, but a civilian adaptation for survival in a violent cityscape. Its very design blurred the boundary between function and performance, between protection and aggression by the 17th century. As firearms reshaped personal combat and public policing became more regulated, the lantern shield faded from practical use. But for a brief period, it embodied the improvisational logic of Renaissance defense, when innovation wasn't just tactical, but necessary. In medieval Europe, long before sugar became a common commodity, honey was the primary sweetener. And far more than that, it was medicine, preservation agent, spiritual offering, and in some cases, a form of tax payment. At the center of this system stood a humble but carefully constructed tool, the biskep. The biskep was a dome-shaped basket made of coiled straw or wicker, often coated with mud or cow dung for insulation. It served as an artificial hive, placed in gardens, orchards, or monastery fields to attract and house swarms of honeybees. The design had no movable parts, no frames, and no easy way to inspect the colony. It was static, closed, and disposable beekeeping. Or apiculture during the Middle Ages was widespread but not standardized. The skep reflected a basic yet functional understanding of bee behavior. Beekeepers, often monks or tenant farmers, knew the timing of swarms, the importance of the queen, and the seasonal rhythms of hive maintenance. But harvesting honey from a skep required ending the colony's life. In most cases, the entire hive was destroyed. Sulfur, smoke, or drowning was used to kill the bees before the skep was broken apart to access the honeycombs inside. Despite the method's brutality, honey production was essential. Honey was used to make mead, a fermented drink with cultural and ceremonial value, and served as a sweetener in cooking and baking. It was also applied to wounds, mixed into salves, and used in early medicinal recipes found in texts like the 12th century Taquinum Sanitatis. Because honey doesn't spoil, it was ideal for long-term storage. The economic value of bees extended beyond honey. Beeswax was in constant demand, especially by the church. Candles used in monasteries and cathedrals had to be made from beeswax, rather than tallow, due to its clean burn and symbolic purity. In England, records from the Domesday Book in 1086 list hives as taxable property, and many estates were required to produce wax or honey as part of their feudal dues. Beekeeping knowledge was often passed down orally or preserved in monastics. Some manuals included illustrations of swarming, hive construction, and even recommended locations for placing skeps, typically south-facing and sheltered from wind. Beekeepers monitored their colonies not by opening them, but by listening to the hum, watching the entrance, and interpreting seasonal behavior. Swarm catching was a practiced art, with wooden clappers, smoke, and baiting techniques used to lure bees into new skeps. During spring migrations, the use of skeps began to decline in the 18th and 19th centuries with the development of movable frame hives, which allowed for inspection and honey harvesting without destroying the colony. But for centuries, the bee skep remained a fixture of medieval agriculture, a tool shaped by trial, necessity, and the careful observation of nature. It was not just a method of production, but a sign of early ecological partnership, where humans learned to farm the wild without fully taming it. In the medieval world, long before factories and mechanical looms, nearly every thread of cloth began with two simple tools, the spindle and the distaff. Carried in hand, tucked under an arm, or strapped to the waist, these tools turned raw wool or flax into yarn, and in the process gave women a form of economic participation rarely acknowledged in formal records. The spindle, a weighted rod that twisted fibers into thread, and the distaff, which held the unspun material, were used across Europe from antiquity through the late Middle Ages. Women of nearly every class, from peasant to noble, were expected to spin. In rural households, spinning was constant, done while walking, minding children, or waiting for water to boil. Yarn was needed for everything: clothing, bedding, sacks, sails, bandages. Every thread not produced meant a cost in trade or tax. This made spinning not just domestic labor, but a foundation of the medieval economy. Women spun for household needs, but also for market sale. In textile-producing regions like Flanders, northern Italy, and England's wool towns, cottage-based spinning fed urban weaving industries. Spinners were often paid by the thread weight, with guilds and regulations emerging by the 13th century to manage quality and output. In some towns, unmarried or widowed women could sustain themselves through spinning alone, a fragile independence. But independence, nonetheless. The tools also carried symbolic weight. In literature and folklore, spinning became shorthand for diligence, patience, and quiet labor. In Norse mythology, the Norns spun the fate of men. In the Roman De La Rose, the distaff appears as a gendered emblem of female virtue. Later, fairy tales from Germany and France, including versions of Sleeping Beauty, centered the spindle as a mystical object, often linked to destiny, danger, or transformation. Church authorities often praised spinning as proper work for women, contrasting it with what they saw as idle vanity. Texts from the 12th and 13th centuries depict Mary, the mother of Christ, spinning in domestic scenes, reinforcing its moral and religious approval. At the same time, legal and economic documents show that some women turned spinning into business. Records from medieval France mention filandeers, professional spinners working under contract. In English manorial rolls, women who produced high volumes of thread or fine yarns were sometimes granted reduced rents or exemptions from other labor duties by the late medieval period. Spinning wheels began to replace the hand spindle in parts of Europe, but for centuries, the spindle and distaff remained central, tools of labor, skill, and survival. They are rarely listed in inventories or chronicles, yet they appear in hundreds of paintings, tapestries, and burial goods. Their absence from most written histories reflects less about their importance and more about who was doing the work. In a world shaped by male-dominated politics and war, the spindle and distaff were tools of a quieter industry, one that clothed kingdoms, powered trade, and gave women a way to shape their own small share of economic life in a medieval household. The day often began not with prayer or toil in the fields, but with the steady rhythm of stone grinding against stone. The tool was simple, a quern, 2 circular stones, the lower one fixed, the upper one rotated by hand. Between them, raw grain was fed through a central hole, then crushed into flour by human strength and repetition. Quern stones were used across Europe for centuries, long before the rise of watermills or windmills. Archaeological finds date them as far back as the Iron Age, but their use persisted well into the Middle Ages, especially in rural areas where access to communal mills was limited or restricted by feudal rights. Each household often had its own quern, and grinding grain became a routine part of domestic life, most often done by women and older children. The physical effort was significant. Turning the upper stone required both hands and a rhythmic, circular motion. A single pound of flour could take upwards of an hour to produce. In wealthier homes, slaves or servants performed the task. In peasant households, it was a daily burden, one that determined whether a family would eat. Querns also carried legal and economic weight. In many feudal territories, lords held the banal right to force tenants to use the lord's mill for grinding grain, charging a portion as payment. The use of private hand querns was sometimes banned outright. In 13th century France and parts of England, records mention lords confiscating querns or fining households for bypassing the official mill, a reminder that even basic tools could be subject to power and control, despite their simplicity. Querns were essential to the staple of the medieval diet, bread, whether made from wheat, rye, barley, or oats. Grain had to be milled before it could be used. The resulting flour fed not just individual families, but entire communities. In monasteries, quern use was incorporated into daily labor. In remote farming villages, they remained the only method of grinding until industrialization. The act of using the quern was repetitive, but not mindless. In some cultures, songs were sung in rhythm with the motion. In others, grinding was done communally, with women working in pairs to speed the process. Religious texts and folklore sometimes referenced the quern as a symbol of sustenance, patience, or the slow but necessary work of life. By the late Middle Ages, larger mills began to dominate flour production in most regions, but even then, the quernstone remained. It was portable, affordable, and reliable, and for countless households, it was the difference between hunger and nourishment. The quernstone didn't just process grain, it structured time, embodied labor, and linked survival to repetition, a tool through which the most basic human need, bread, became a shared daily task. In medieval households, illness was treated with what was available: herbs, warmth, prayer, and above all, tradition. Among the most enduring remedies was a mixture of hot milk, wine or ale, and aromatic spices, served in a small, rounded ceramic vessel with a long spout. The posset pot, the drink it held. The posset was both a comfort and a cure. Recipes varied, but the basic ingredients remained the same. Heated milk was curdled with wine or beer, then mixed with ginger, nutmeg, sugar, or honey. In wealthier homes, cinnamon and cloves were added, imported at high cost through Mediterranean trade. Roots. The drink was consumed while still warm, often from bed, believed to soothe coughs, settle the stomach, and draw out fevers. The vessels themselves were distinct. Made of earthenware or glazed ceramic, posset pots typically had a handle and one or more spouts for sipping the liquid while the curds settled below. Some had lids, others intricate decorations. Surviving examples from the 15th and 16th centuries have been found across England, particularly in households with some means, suggesting that possets were not just medicine but social ritual. The use of possets bridged folk tradition and learned medicine. Medieval medical theory, grounded in the Greco-Roman system of humors, placed great emphasis on balance: hot versus cold, dry versus moist. A warm, spiced drink fit this framework perfectly, especially in treating cold ailments like chills, respiratory congestion, or digestive distress. Possets were often listed in early pharmacopoeias and physician handbooks. The Tequinum Sanitatis, a 13th century medical guide derived from Islamic sources, mentions similar warm drinks as part of seasonal treatments. Outside medical theory, possets became embedded in wider belief systems. In rural communities, they were sometimes given before bed to induce sleep or to women recovering from childbirth. Some recipes called for the drink to be blessed by a priest, or for herbs to be stirred in a particular direction. In a world without germ theory, healing was not only physical but symbolic. The posset pot also made its way into the cultural language of the time. Shakespeare referenced it in Hamlet and Macbeth, using it as a symbol of comfort and, in one case, poison. By the 17th century, elaborate silver posset pots were given as wedding gifts among the English gentry, their use expanding beyond illness into ceremony and hospitality. As medical science developed and new treatments emerged, the posset and its pot gradually faded from formal use. But for hundreds of years, they stood at the intersection of medicine, domestic life, and belief. They were a reflection of a time when care was administered not in hospitals, but at the hearth, when healing meant warmth, familiarity, and the hope that comfort itself could cure. In the mud-soaked streets of medieval towns and the rain-beaten paths of the countryside, boots were not fashion, they were necessity. Whether made of leather, cloth, or metal-reinforced hide, footwear protected against thorns, snow, and disease. But once soaked, caked in filth, or stiff from wear, removing them was no easy task. That's where the iron bootjack came in. The design was simple, a flat iron or wooden board with a U-shaped cutout at one end. One stood on it with one foot and wedged the heel of the other boot into the notch, then pulled upward. The bootjack gripped the heel while body weight provided the counterforce. For someone returning from the field, the forge, or battle, it was a minor but immediate relief. No bending, no sitting, no wrestling with hardened leather straps. While the bootjack lacks the symbolism of weapons or religious artifacts, it tells us something more intimate about medieval life. Comfort was hard-won. Laborers walked miles daily, often through uneven terrain. Soldiers, once dismounted, dealt with chainmail shows and leather greaves strapped tightly to the leg. Farmers trudged through wet fields, their boots soaked and heavy. Removing them without help risked injury or damage to the boot itself, expensive to repair, especially for those with limited means. The bootjack became particularly common in the later Middle Ages as footwear grew more structured. In England and the Low Countries, archaeological digs at rural estates and manor homes have unearthed iron bootjacks dating to the 14th and 15th centuries. Some were crude, others decorative. A few incorporated handles or hinges. In wealthier households, they were part of the entryway, placed beside wash basins and benches, used by servants and masters alike, though rarely recorded in writing. The presence of the bootjack in surviving inventories suggests it was widespread. In one 15th century account from a Yorkshire estate, a bootjack is listed among household tools alongside shears, bellows, and spinning equipment. These were not ceremonial items. They were used daily, year-round, in castles and garrisons. Boot removal became a more elaborate process. For knights returning from campaign, removing layers of armor, including armored sabatons or padded footwear, was often done with assistance. But even then, the basic bootjack remained a supporting tool, part of the rhythm of dressing and undressing in a time when even clothing could be a burden. What the bootjack reveals is that medieval people valued moments of ease, however brief, in lives filled with physical strain. It reminds us that history isn't only made of wars, plagues, and power struggles. Sometimes it's found in the shape of a simple tool on a stone floor, used, worn, and quietly appreciated. In medieval towns, waste didn't vanish. It was carried by hand, at night, in wooden or metal buckets filled with human excrement. Before sewers, before pipes, and long before flushing toilets, this was sanitation, the night soil system. And the people who made it work, night soil men, performed one of the most vital and least acknowledged roles in urban life. In most European cities, household waste was collected in chamber pots, which were emptied either into cesspits or, more commonly, into buckets. These were stored in backyards, cellars, or latrines, temporary holding spaces, until someone came to collect the contents. That job usually fell to hired laborers who worked in darkness, often between midnight and dawn. In England, they were known as nightmen. In Paris, vidanges. In German cities, they were simply called latrinabiter. The task was dangerous and degrading. The night soil men lifted heavy loads up narrow stairs, navigated unlit alleys, and moved quietly to avoid disrupting the sleeping public. In cities like London or Prague, regulations required them to dispose of waste outside city walls, often using carts to carry barrels of waste to designated dumps or riverbanks. The stench was overwhelming, infections were common, payment was low. Despite the social stigma, their work prevented far worse outcomes. Without this system, streets would overflow, disease would spread faster, and urban life would become unlivable. The link between sanitation and public health was not fully understood, but the effects were visible. During outbreaks of plague or dysentery, cities often hired additional night soil workers to manage rising waste levels. In some cases, these men were exempted from taxes or conscription due to the risks of their work. Cesspits were periodically cleaned, a brutal process that required manual scooping. In large inns or manors, brick-lined vaults stored waste beneath latrines. These were emptied every few years, often by contract workers who used long-handled tools and ropes to extract the sludge. In dense medieval quarters, such as the Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt or the packed districts of Paris, access was limited. Buckets were hoisted over balconies, or waste was carried through buildings, one trip at a time. City records occasionally mention these workers by name, mostly in legal disputes over spilled contents or failed payments. They appear in guild accounts, tax rolls, and complaints filed by neighbors, but for the most part, their labor remained invisible. It was hidden beneath the rhythms of daily life, essential but unspoken. The night soil system survived well into the 18th and 19th centuries, until modern plumbing and centralized sewage slowly replaced it. But for hundreds of years, these buckets, and the people who carried them, kept cities functioning. They managed the filth no one wanted to see in silence, without praise, and with consequences that affected everyone. Many of the tools that shaped medieval life have vanished from memory, not because they were irrelevant, but because they were ordinary, carried, worn, handled, and passed down through generations. They were so embedded in daily routines that few thought to record them. And yet, behind every worn quern stone, every soot-stained posset pot, or rusted caltrop, is a record of how people solved problems, endured hardship, and adapted with what they had. The idea that the Middle Ages were defined by stagnation or ignorance oversimplifies a far more complex reality. These centuries were filled with practical innovation. In the absence of industrial machinery, people developed low-tech solutions that worked, often with efficiency modern systems would admire. A yoke to balance burdens, a flail to process food, a badge to verify travel. None of it ornamental, all of it necessary. The ingenuity wasn't always found in invention. It was found in persistence, in shared knowledge passed through households, not academies, in tools made to solve real problems with limited materials, in systems of trust, like tally sticks that replaced absent coinage, in defense mechanisms, like caltrops, used not only by armies, but by villagers with no standing force to protect them. These were tools of survival. They belonged to laborers, midwives, shepherds, guards, and craftspeople, people often unnamed in history books, but who formed the foundation of every medieval society. Their work left little written trace, but it filled the cities, farms, and fields of Europe. Every pot, every stick, every stone tool carried decisions made in context: what to use, how to shape it, when to rely on it. As modern technology distances us from physical labor, it becomes easier to forget the historical knowledge once embedded in the hands. But the story of human progress isn't linear. It's layered, built on trial, error, repetition, and adaptation. Many of the medieval tools may seem crude today, but they tell a deeper truth, that creativity does not always require complexity, and that history's so-called forgotten tools are often the ones that kept everything going.